Chapter 2. A Historian's Dispute. In the 1870s, Heinrich von Treitschke was a well-known historian holding a respected chair at the University of Berlin. His highly praised work The History of Germany in the 19th Century began to appear in 1879, and that year the prestigious magazine Prussian Yearbooks, of which he was co-editor, published an important essay of his. The essay was entitled One Word About Our Jewry and was arguably the first academic legitimation of scholarly revulsion for the Jewish identity. The respected historian's chief anxiety was demographic. Waves of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe had enlarged the Jewish presence in Germany, which was perceived as a threat to the German nation's very existence. These immigrants, Treitschke argued, did not in the least resemble Jews of Spanish origin. The latter had lived in a tolerant society and therefore became well integrated into their host nations in Western Europe. But Polish Jews had suffered from Christianity's heavy hand, which left them deformed and alien to the superior German culture, so that their integration might give rise to a mongrel German Jewish culture. These Jews would have to make a tremendous effort to assimilate into the German nation, which was still barred to them. But this hoped-for development was far from being achieved, because they were being led by scholars who preached self-segregation, notably the impertinent historian Heinrich Graetz. Treitschke had read History of the Jews, or at any rate its final volumes, and was enraged. Do read Graetz's History of the Jews. What zealous rage against the age-old enemy, Christianity, what deadly hatred for purest and grandest representatives of the German nation, from Luther to Goethe and Fichte. And what overblown, hollow and offensive pride. Nor is this rigid hatred for the German Gentiles by any means confined to the mind of a single zealot. Graetz was not intimidated by Treitschke's high standing, and wrote a closely argued response to the anti-Jewish critique. But he could not resist concluding his article with a provocative quote from Benjamin Disraeli. "You cannot destroy a pure Caucasian race. This is a psychological fact, a law of nature, that dismayed the kings of Egypt, and Assyria, Roman emperors and Christian inquisitors. No punitive system, no physical torture, can cause a superior race to be consumed or destroyed by an inferior one." Faced with such nationalist obstinacy, Treitschke heightened the tone and bared his historiographical teeth. A full merger of Jewry with the peoples of the West will never be achieved. It may only be possible to soften the opposition, since it is rooted in ancient history. Moreover, he discerned in Graetz an aspiration to have Jewry acknowledged as a nation within the German nation, an aspiration that every authentic German had to reject out of hand. He went on to charge Graetz with nationalist Jewish conceit, and wondered at length if the latter saw himself as a German in any way. No, he concluded, Graetz was an alien in his accidental homeland, an Oriental who neither understands nor wants to understand our nation. He and we have nothing in common, except that he possesses our citizenship and uses our mother tongue, though only in order to curse and swear at us. Then the Prussian historian let rip. But if this racial conceit becomes public, if Jewry even demands recognition of its national status, it demolishes the legal foundation of emancipation. There is only one way to fulfill these aspirations: emigration, the creation of a Jewish state somewhere outside our country, and then it will see if it can win the recognition of other nations. There is no room for dual nationhood on Germany's soil. It took thousands of years of toil to construct the German states, and Jews had no part in that. Treitschke's detestation of Jews' origin in the East would grow more extreme. For now, it was a middle-of-the-road position between civil nationalism and outright racial nationalism. Unlike more vulgar anti-Semites, such as Wilhelm Marr or Adolf Stucker, he did not rule out the possibility of Jews joining the German nation. But his long-term historical contrast between a Jewish people and a German people revealed his essentialist tendency to regard Jewishness and Germanity as two contradictory, hence irreconcilable, identities. Treitschke's nationalism was suffused with an ethnicist essentialist outlook, in which the Jew remained a Jew even if his culture and language were purely German. In this he was, in fact, not very different in principle from Graetz, who in the final chapters of his book presented similar, even identical, positions. While Graetz was not yet a full-fledged nationalist historian, his entire opus is imbued with an abstract, if ambiguous, longing for state sovereignty. Though he was one of the first thinkers who helped construct a new secular link between the Jews and their ancient homeland, he remained, unlike his opponent Treitschko or his friend Hess, skeptical about Jewish migration to that homeland. Despite his association with Hess, and his brief but emotional visit to the ancestral land, he was not actually a Zionist. That is why in his second response to Treitschko's challenge he retreated, evaded and disingenuously denied that he had ever defined Judaism as a nationality. In the heat of the debate, and possibly in view of the harsh reactions of most German Jewish intellectuals, Graetz momentarily saw himself again as a thorough German who demanded nothing but equal rights. And since Treitschko disparaged Graetz's non-German origin, the author of History of the Jews repaid the Berlin historian with the same toxic currency. Is not Treitschko a Slavic name? The clash of the two ethnocentric historians exposed the significant inner struggle in the consolidation of German nationalism. For both Graetz and Treitschko, the nation was principally a matter of descent, the product of an ancient, linear and prolonged history, supported by, respectively, Germanic mythology or the Old Testament. The nation is in effect a people race, originating in the distant past, whose weight determines and outlines collective identities in the present. Both historians were imbued with a Völkisch national outlook, whence their doubts about the possibility of symbiosis between Germans of Jewish background and Germans of Christian origin. Neither believed that there was much point in trying to bolster such interrelations, since in the imagined national roots of both groups there had never been a divorce between Jews and Germans, as there had never been a marriage. It should be noted that quite a few German intellectuals of non-Jewish origin disputed this pessimistic and deterministic position. As pointed out in the first chapter, it is a mistake to assume that all the proponents of German nationalism were of the Völkisch persuasion, much less anti-Semitic. Many liberals, as well as most social democrats, believed in an inclusive republican identity, of which the German Jews were an integral part. Similarly, the German Jewish intelligentsia, which was naturally appalled by Treitschko's hostility, was sharply at odds with Graetz's national ethnicist position. From Moritz Lazarus, a professor of philosophy at Berlin University, through Harry Breslau, his colleague in the history department, to Hermann Cohen, Graetz's former student who became a well-known neo-Kantian philosopher at the University of Marburg, all were strongly critical of Graetz. They all agreed that there could not be two nationalities in a single state, but also maintained that there should be diversity within the unifying nation. Germanity itself was a historical product of various cultural elements, they argued, and it was flexible enough to continue absorbing them. The Jews, like other subjects of the empire, Protestants and Catholics, were first of all Germans and only secondarily Jews. No doubt some of the intellectuals of Jewish background believed in their distinct racial origin, but almost all decided that what mattered was the future national cultural project, and that project was German. The problem was that the elevated dispute among the historians was taking place in a murky atmosphere of low-level antisemitism that had spread through various parts of society. A series of economic crises during the 1870s, while it did not block the accelerating forces of industrialization, created a sense of economic insecurity that was immediately translated into anxieties of identity, a historical phenomenon that would become familiar in the 20th century. The decisive victory of 1870, and the unification of the Raya from above soon lost their unifying glory, and the people blamed for the crises were, as always, the others, the religious and racial minorities. The progress of mass democracy also stimulated the rise of political antisemitism, an effective means of rallying mass support in modern times. From the streets through the press to the corridors of imperial power, venomous propaganda was aimed at the Orientals who had come from the East and claimed to be Germans. There were open calls to repeal the Emancipation. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that a public petition appeared in 1880, signed by 75 intellectuals and liberal public figures of non-Jewish origin, seeking to diffuse and thwart the renewed wave of antisemitism. One of the most prominent and prestigious signatories was Theodore Mommsen. This great historian of ancient Rome was not content merely to append his signature, he chose to get involved in the debate about the Jewish question. He clearly understood that the issue was not just the status of the Jews, but the nature and quality of German nationality. A few months after the petition, he published a fascinating essay entitled Another Word About Our Jury. It was a direct reply to his colleague Treitschke, and from then on, the debate of the historians involved three leading spokesmen. Make no mistake, both as a historian and a citizen, Mommsen was a nationalist. He supported the unification of Germany, even its forcible annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. But he was worried by the growing ethnicization of German nationalism in the 1870s, which prompted him to write, ironically, "We shall soon have a situation in which a full citizen will be only one who can look back on his origins and see himself as a descendant of one of the three sons of Manus, secondly, who believes in the Gospels only as a priest interprets them, thirdly, who is skilled at plowing and sowing." To construct a modern nation in the light of Tacitus's writings about ancient Germany would mean leaving out not only the German Jews but a good many other inhabitants of the Rhine. The author of History of Rome, who had been a revolutionary republican in his youth, always held to a civil concept of nationalism. Like all 19th century historians, Mommsen assumed, naively, that nations and nationalism had existed since antiquity. But if Treitschke saw the origin of the German nation in the Teutonic kingdoms, and Graetz saw the source of the Jewish nation in the kingdom of David and Solomon, for Mommsen the supreme historical model was Rome in the time of Julius Caesar, with its open and flexible concept of citizenship. His imagined nation evolved from the dual source of his political past and his historiographic work. He detested the isolationism inherent in ancient identities, just as he despised the modern racism in his own political present. His knowledge of the ancient history of Judea came mostly through imperial Roman sources, although the first page of the chapter entitled Judah and the Jews in his History of Rome suggests that he was also well acquainted with Jost's writing. Mommsen did not think that the Judeans were necessarily the spiritual successors of the ancient Hebrews, and assumed that most of the Jews throughout the Roman Empire were not direct biological descendants of the inhabitants of Judea. His anti-essentialist historical view of the development of nations came to the fore in the Treitschke-Graetz dispute. To Mommsen, the Jews were not an alien people race but one of the tribes or communities integral to the new Germany. They were no different, in principle, from the people of Schleswig-Holstein, Mommsen's birthplace, or the population of Hanover or Hesse. A modern nation is the result of the blending of diverse cultural components from different sources. He felt that the Jews should indeed integrate into their surroundings, shedding, to the best of their consciousness and ability, a significant degree of their isolationist distinctiveness, but that they ought to do so just as any of Germany's other tribes had to forego some elements of their pre-modern local culture. The Jews had entered the German nation through a different gate than Germany's other tribes, but this entrance gave them a distinctive quality. Without doubt, just as the Jews in the Roman Empire were an element that disbanded nations, they are an element dismantling tribalism in Germany. We ought to be pleased that in Germany's capital, where these tribes have gathered more than elsewhere, the Jews occupy an enviable position. I see no harm at all in the fact that the Jews have been efficiently working this way for ages. Altogether, it seems to be that God understood much better than Mr. Stucker why it took a certain percentage of Jews to temper the German steel. It is clear that Mommsen regarded the Jews, who had functioned as dismantles of prenational provincialisms, not merely as Germans but as the promising first agents of the new Germanity. The Jews were relatively urban and bourgeois, had a prominent presence in the educated classes, and made a major contribution to the spread of High German, which had become the national language. As we know, this liberal attitude of Mommsen and other German national liberals would lose out in the long run. Not only was their model of civil nationalism defeated in the first half of the 20th century but, ironically, in 1933, at the conference of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the scholarly Joseph Goebbels praised the great Mommsen's dismantling element as a model anti-Jewish position, similar, in his view, to Richard Wagner's idea of the Jew. Treitschke and Graetz did not respond publicly to Mommsen's intervention, though obviously neither one welcomed a third position that dismantled such a natural and logical ethno-national discourse. Graetz's entire oeuvre was directed against the historiography notably represented by Jost in the early 19th century, and Mommsen in the later 19th. He regarded this position as anti-Jewish because it firmly rejected the continuity and eternity of a Jewish people race, paralleling that of the German Volk, which, in the biblical narrative, had been born in earliest times and then scattered throughout the world.